The ice storm hit Metropolitan City at 4:47 a.m. on February 15, turning every road into a death trap. By 6:30 a.m., 3 school districts had already canceled classes. 4 bus drivers had called in sick. 2 more refused to drive in the conditions. But on Route 27, veteran driver Robert Hayes was already behind the wheel of his yellow school bus, studying weather patterns with the intensity of someone whose life had once depended on reading storms correctly. What the 47 children boarding his bus that morning didn't know was that their quiet, reliable driver had spent 18 years navigating aircraft carriers and submarines through some of the world's most dangerous waters as a U.S. Navy navigation officer. And today those skills would save their lives. Robert Hayes was 44 years old, had been driving school bus Route 27 for Meadowbrook Elementary for 5 years and 3 months. Every morning at 6:15 a.m., he arrived wearing his standard school district uniform, but his pre-drive routine revealed something different. While other drivers checked mirrors and adjusted seats, Robert conducted what he called his operational assessment. Weather conditions, traffic patterns, construction zones, alternate routes. The other drivers joked about his methodical approach. Hayes acts like he's plotting a course across the Pacific, Transportation Supervisor Jennifer Chen had said more than once. She had no idea how accurate that statement was. The school staff and parent community knew Robert as the driver who never missed a pickup, never got lost, never seemed rattled by traffic or weather. In 5 years, he'd maintained a perfect safety record. 0 incidents. 0 complaints. Parents specifically requested Route 27 because they trusted Robert with their children's lives. What they didn't notice was the way Robert's eyes constantly scanned for threats, assessed traffic patterns 3 moves ahead, calculated optimal positioning for any scenario. The way he organized his route book with military precision. The way he spoke in measured, controlled tones even during the most chaotic morning rushes. These weren't just good driving habits. They were survival skills honed in environments where a single navigation error could sink a billion-dollar warship and kill 3,000 sailors. Robert had chosen school bus driving specifically because it allowed him to use those skills to protect children instead of conducting naval operations in hostile waters. After 18 years of plotting courses through enemy-controlled seas, he'd found peace in the suburban routes of Meadowbrook Elementary. But on this particular morning, as ice began forming on his windshield, Robert felt the familiar weight of responsibility that had once guided nuclear submarines through Arctic waters. His naval career had begun in 2001, fresh out of the Naval Academy with a degree in oceanographic navigation. He'd planned on a peaceful career in maritime transportation, maybe eventually teaching navigation at the academy. The Navy had other plans. When you score in the 99th percentile on spatial reasoning tests and demonstrate an almost supernatural ability to read weather patterns, the Navy doesn't let you waste that talent on civilian shipping lanes. Within 6 months, Robert was in advanced navigation officer training, learning to guide multi-billion-dollar vessels through waters where GPS signals were jammed and electronic warfare made standard navigation impossible. The training was brutal. 2 years of intensive instruction covering everything from celestial navigation to tactical route planning in hostile environments. Students learned to navigate by stars, by ocean currents, by the subtle behavior of seabirds. They practiced plotting courses while explosions shook their instruments and enemy forces tried to jam their communications. Robert had been one of only 6 candidates to complete the program successfully. One of even fewer selected for the Navy's most sensitive assignments. His first deployment was aboard the USS Columbia, a nuclear submarine conducting classified missions in the South China Sea. In the absolute darkness 300 feet below the surface, Robert learned to navigate by sound, by water temperature, by the gentle vibrations of distant shipping lanes. From there, he'd moved to aircraft carrier operations in the Persian Gulf, where his job was guiding 100,000-ton vessels through narrow straits while hostile forces tracked their every movement. Later came Arctic operations, where a navigation error could trap a submarine under polar ice for months. Over 18 years, Robert had guided naval vessels through hurricanes, enemy minefields, and waters so dangerous that even their locations remained classified decades later. He'd navigated by starlight when electronics failed, by memory when charts were destroyed, by instinct when all other methods proved useless. The stress had been constant. Every course he plotted carried the weight of thousands of lives and millions of dollars in equipment. Every decision could mean the difference between mission success and international incident. When Robert completed his naval service in 2019, he'd been offered lucrative positions with shipping companies, defense contractors, and navigation technology firms. All of them wanted to capitalize on his expertise in high-stakes maritime operations. But Robert had seen enough of life-and-death navigation. He wanted to use his skills to serve his community in peaceful ways. School bus driving offered the perfect solution: precise route planning, safety-critical decision-making, and responsibility for precious cargo, but without the threat of enemy action. For 5 years, Robert had found satisfaction in the routine. Morning routes through suburban neighborhoods. Afternoon pickups at Meadowbrook Elementary. The occasional field trip to the Science Museum or local park. His naval training had seemed like unnecessary overkill for such simple tasks. Until February 15th, when an ice storm turned Metropolitan City into a navigation nightmare that would test every skill he'd learned in 18 years of naval operations. The weather alert had come in at 4:15 a.m., freezing rain moving through the region, expected to create hazardous driving conditions by 6 a.m. 3 neighboring districts had already announced school closures. Meadowbrook's transportation department was debating whether to follow suit. Robert stood in his kitchen, studying weather radar on his phone with the same intensity he'd once brought to analyzing storm systems in the North Atlantic. The ice storm was moving faster than predicted. Surface temperatures were dropping rapidly. Road conditions would deteriorate quickly once the precipitation began. But he also saw something the weather services might miss: a narrow window of opportunity. If he could complete his route before 8:30 a.m., he could get all 47 children to school safely. If he waited for conditions to improve, they might not get another chance for days. At 6:15 a.m., Robert started his bus and began what would become the most challenging navigation operation of his career. The first sign of trouble came at his third stop. As 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez climbed aboard, her mother approached the driver's window with obvious concern. "Robert, are you sure it's safe to drive in this? The roads are already getting slippery." Robert adjusted his rearview mirror, checking the growing layer of ice on his windshield. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I've driven in worse conditions. Emma will get to school safely." What he didn't add was that he'd once navigated an aircraft carrier through a typhoon in the Western Pacific. Ice on suburban roads, while dangerous, was manageable with the right skills and preparation. By his 7th stop, other drivers were already reporting problems. The radio crackled with updates. Bus 14 just slid off Maple Street. No injuries, but we're stuck. Bus 22 turning back. Can't maintain traction on Highway 9. Transportation Supervisor Jennifer Chen's voice came through clearly. "All drivers use extreme caution. If conditions become unsafe, abort your routes and return to base." Robert acknowledged the transmission but continued his route. In his side mirrors, he could see the ice storm intensifying. Other buses were indeed turning back. But Robert had identified something the other drivers hadn't: an alternate route system that would allow him to complete his mission. During his 5 years on Route 27, Robert had memorized every street, alley, and back road in his coverage area. More importantly, he'd analyzed the topography, drainage patterns, and microclimate variations that would affect ice formation. Some roads would become impassable quickly. Others would remain navigable longer due to elevation, traffic patterns, or proximity to heat sources. At his 15th stop, as 10-year-old Marcus Chen boarded the bus, Robert made his decision. Instead of following his standard route to Meadowbrook Elementary, he would implement what he privately called Emergency Navigation Protocol Alpha, a route optimization strategy based on principles he'd learned for navigating aircraft carriers through hostile waters. The children noticed the change immediately. "Mr. Hayes, this isn't the way we usually go," said 6th grader Sarah Kim from the 3rd row. "We're taking a scenic route today," Robert replied calmly, his hands steady on the wheel as he guided the bus down a residential side street that avoided the main highway entirely. What Sarah didn't realize was that she was witnessing advanced tactical navigation in action. Robert was applying lessons learned from guiding nuclear submarines through enemy-controlled waters to the challenge of transporting school children through an ice storm. Every turn was calculated. Every speed adjustment was deliberate. Every route selection was based on real-time assessment of changing conditions and optimal risk management. Behind them, the radio continued crackling with updates from other drivers. Bus after bus was reporting problems, turning back, or getting stuck. But Bus 27 continued moving steadily toward Meadowbrook Elementary, taking roads that other drivers didn't even know existed. At 7:45 a.m., when most other buses had already given up, Robert's radio crackled with an urgent transmission. "Bus 27, what's your status? We're showing you off your normal route." Bus 27 proceeding to school via alternate navigation. Robert responded. All passengers secure. Estimated arrival 8:15 a.m. There was a pause. Then, Robert, conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Are you sure you can make it? Robert glanced in his rearview mirror at the 47 children in his care. Some were reading. Some were chatting quietly. A few were pressed against the windows, watching the ice-covered landscape pass by. None of them seemed worried or afraid. They trusted him completely. Affirmative, Robert said. Navigation conditions within acceptable parameters. What he meant was that he'd successfully guided naval vessels through far worse conditions. But to the children on his bus, he was just Mr. Hayes, their reliable driver who always got them to school safely. The real test came at 7:52 a.m., when Robert approached the final mile to Meadowbrook Elementary. The main approach road was completely iced over. 2 cars had already slid into ditches. A police cruiser was setting up a roadblock to prevent other vehicles from attempting passage. Any normal driver would have turned back. But Robert wasn't a normal driver. He was a former Navy navigation officer who had once guided the USS Hampton through an ice field in the Bering Sea. He knew something about navigating treacherous conditions that the police officer didn't. Instead of approaching the school from the main road, Robert took a service road that curved around behind the building. It was longer, narrower, and technically not part of his approved route. But his analysis of topographical maps and drainage patterns indicated it would have better traction due to its southern exposure and proximity to the school's heating system. The maneuver worked perfectly. While other vehicles struggled on the main road, Bus 27 pulled safely into the Meadowbrook Elementary parking lot at exactly 8:13 a.m. As the children filed off the bus, several teachers approached with amazement. "Robert, how did you get here?" asked Principal Dr. Sarah Martinez. Every other bus turned back. "The police are telling people not to drive." Robert secured his parking brake and began his post-route checklist. "Sometimes you have to find alternate paths, Dr. Martinez. The important thing is that the children arrived safely." Dr. Martinez stared at him. "But how did you know which roads would be safe?" The ice storm hit faster than anyone predicted. Robert paused his paperwork. "I've had some experience with weather navigation, ma'am. You learn to read conditions and adapt accordingly." What he didn't mention was that he'd once plotted a course for 3 aircraft carriers through a hurricane in the Atlantic Ocean. Compared to that operation, navigating an ice storm in suburban Metropolitan City was relatively straightforward. But Dr. Martinez wasn't satisfied with the simple explanation. Over the next hour, as reports came in about the transportation crisis affecting other districts, she began asking more pointed questions. "Robert, I've checked with other drivers. They're all experienced professionals. None of them thought it was safe to drive this morning. What made you confident you could make it?" Robert finished his vehicle inspection report. "Different people have different comfort levels with challenging conditions, Dr. Martinez. I've always been comfortable with navigation problems. But how did you know about those back roads?" "I've lived here for 10 years and I didn't know half those streets existed." "Part of the job is knowing your territory," Robert said simply. Dr. Martinez exchanged glances with Transportation Supervisor Jennifer Chin, who had arrived to check on Robert's remarkable success. "Robert," Jennifer said carefully, "what you did this morning was extraordinary. Our dispatch was tracking you on GPS. You used roads that aren't even on our official route maps. You completed a route that 7 other experienced drivers couldn't finish. That's not just good driving, that's something else entirely." Robert looked up from his paperwork. "Ma'am, I just did my job. The children needed to get to school safely, so I found a way to make that happen." "But how?" Dr. Martinez pressed. "Where did you learn navigation skills like that?" Robert hesitated. For 5 years, he'd successfully avoided detailed questions about his background. His employment application had listed previous government service, but he'd never elaborated. The school district had been satisfied with his clean driving record and excellent references. Now, faced with direct questions from administrators who had witnessed something extraordinary, Robert found himself at a crossroads. He could continue deflecting, maintain his quiet anonymity, keep his naval background private. Or he could trust these people who had trusted him with their children's lives. "I learned navigation in the Navy," he said finally. "I was a navigation officer for 18 years. Jennifer blinked. "Navy navigation? Like on ships?" "Aircraft carriers and submarines," Robert confirmed. "I specialized in navigation operations in hostile environments." Dr. Martinez sat down slowly. And you've been driving a school bus for 5 years? Robert nodded. After I retired from the Navy, I wanted to use my skills to serve the community in peaceful ways. School transportation seemed like a good fit. A good fit? Jennifer's voice was almost a whisper. Robert, you've been using million-dollar naval training to drive children to elementary school? The principles are the same, Robert said. Route planning, risk assessment, adapting to changing conditions. The stakes are actually higher here. These children are more precious than any cargo I transported in the Navy. Dr. Martinez stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the ice-covered parking lot where Robert's bus sat, the only school vehicle that had successfully completed its route that morning. Robert, she said slowly, do you realize what you've done? While experienced drivers were turning back, while police were setting up roadblocks, you navigated 47 children through the worst ice storm in 5 years using, what, submarine navigation techniques? Robert considered this. The specific techniques vary, but the fundamental approach is consistent. Analyze conditions, identify optimal routes, execute with precision. Jennifer shook her head in amazement. We had no idea. All this time we thought you were just really good at driving. I am really good at driving, Robert said with a slight smile. But I had some unusual training. The news of Robert's successful navigation spread quickly through the school district. By afternoon, his story had reached the Regional Transportation Authority. By evening, local news stations were calling for interviews. But Robert declined most media attention. He wasn't interested in fame or recognition. He'd accomplished his mission, getting children to school safely despite dangerous conditions. However, the school district administration had other ideas. Robert, Dr. Martinez said during a meeting the following week, we've been thinking about your unique qualifications. Would you be interested in helping us develop better emergency protocols for severe weather situations? Robert considered this. What kind of protocols? Route optimization for extreme conditions. Training for other drivers in advanced navigation techniques. Maybe consulting on our emergency response procedures. Jennifer Chin leaned forward. Robert, what you did wasn't just individual skill. It was systematic expertise that could benefit our entire transportation operation. We'd like you to share that knowledge. Robert thought about his 18 years in the Navy, the countless hours spent training junior officers in navigation techniques, the responsibility he'd felt for passing on critical skills to the next generation. I suppose I could develop some training materials, he said slowly. Navigation principles that might be useful for school transportation. Would you be willing to conduct workshops? Dr. Martinez asked. Teach other drivers how to assess conditions and plan routes the way you do? Robert nodded. Education is important. If my experience can help keep more children safe, I'm willing to share it. 6 months later, Robert Hayes was teaching navigation workshops for school districts throughout the region. His Advanced Route Planning for Emergency Conditions seminar had become mandatory training for transportation supervisors. But he never forgot why he'd entered this profession. Every morning at 6:15 a.m., he still climbed behind the wheel of Bus 27, still conducted his pre-route operational assessment, still transported 47 children safely to Meadowbrook Elementary. The only difference was that now, when parents asked how he always seemed to know the safest routes, he had a better answer. Ma'am, I spent 18 years learning to navigate safely through dangerous conditions. Now I use those skills to make sure your children get to school and back home again. One parent, Mrs. Rodriguez, had smiled and said, Well, I'm glad the Navy trained you so well. Robert had nodded seriously. So am I, ma'am. So am I. The memorial plaque outside Meadowbrook Elementary now reads, In honor of Robert Hayes, whose navigation expertise ensured that no child was left behind, even in the most challenging conditions. But Robert had requested a different inscription, dedicated to safe passage and the trust of parents who believe their children will always find their way home. Because that's what navigation is really about, not just finding your destination but ensuring that everyone under your care arrives safely, regardless of the obstacles in your path. The skills Robert learned plotting courses for aircraft carriers and submarines may have seemed like overkill for suburban school routes. But on one ice-covered morning in February, when 47 children needed to get to school safely, those skills made all the difference. Sometimes the most important navigation operations happen not in hostile waters or enemy territory, but on the quiet streets of suburban neighborhoods, where former Navy officers choose to use their expertise to ensure that children can safely access education every day, no matter what challenges nature puts in their path. Sometimes the greatest navigation expertise belongs to people providing essential community services rather than conducting military operations, people who've chosen to apply naval training to civilian safety, ensuring that skills developed for maritime navigation can be used to protect children during their daily journeys to learning and discovery. We need to recognize and appreciate the skilled professionals among us who've chosen to serve quietly, especially those whose previous service required navigating through dangerous waters so that children could safely travel to school in peaceful community environments. Because true navigation expertise doesn't disappear when military service ends, it just finds new applications. And sometimes the most valuable maritime training involves not naval operations or military missions, but school transportation that ensures the systematic navigation skills developed for Navy operations can be used to protect children and strengthen communities through reliable educational access that creates opportunities during formative years and gives students the safe, dependable transportation they need to succeed academically. Today, when ice storms threaten Metropolitan City, parents specifically request that their children be assigned to Route 27. Not just because Robert Hayes is a good driver, but because they know he's someone who understands that getting children safely to their destination isn't just transportation, it's a sacred trust. And navigation, whether across hostile seas or through suburban ice storms, is ultimately about honoring that trust.